Good day to you, and welcome to Fascinating. I'm your host, Rick, from planet Vulcan. My ongoing mission on planet Earth to search for signs of intelligence and to encourage its spread. This episode is one of a series of book reviews originally published on the Fascinating podcast. Those of you who have been following this podcast are familiar with the term ignorangi. Ignorangi is ignorance spelled backwards, and the definition of the term is knowing that which is not true. It is a word that we Vulcans have coined to refer to widespread erroneous beliefs on planet Earth, also referred to as collective illusions, by Earthling author and commentator Todd Rose. We are trying to make a dent in ignorangi on planet Earth because actions based on ignorangi are at best a colossal and useless squandering of time and talent, and at worst can be quite damaging to your social fabric. Some of our philosophers have speculated about the curious phenomenon we observe among so many Earthlings, where they give themselves permission to reject many obvious conclusions about nature that are based on scientific investigation. Our psychologists suspect that this rejection, which is so profoundly nonsensical, if you look at it from the scientific viewpoint, is a symbolic act of defying parental domination during one's early years, a sort of coming of age. We should note that we have also observed the reverse, that is, many cases of Earthlings deciding that submitting to parental authority is a must. It's as if the submitters are thinking, I must do what my parents tell me, even if it does not comport with reason. Otherwise, I might undermine my family and my community. For the rejectors, it's as if they are thinking, I don't have to do what my parents tell me anymore. Even though, by the time they're adults, it is reality and not their parents that is telling them things. We have heard some Earthlings exclaim, what kind of freedom is that, where I have to recognize any limitations at all? We are having difficulty understanding how, in either of these stances, so many Earthlings remain far into adulthood, focused on the parental domination they once faced, and not on an entirely different, mature viewpoint, which is that one relies on one's own judgment in such a way that parental authority, which had its proper time and place, is no longer relevant. There is currently on planet Earth a superstar rejecter of authority whose body of work is hugely influential and which constitutes a fairly definitive catalog of ignorangi. At its heart, his work appears to be based on his belief that nature places no limits on the abilities of Earthlings to construct their reality. This man presents as a mild-mannered, soft-spoken, caring man, which makes it all the more shocking when you listen to what he wants to do. This man, a Harvard professor named Michael Sandel, commits pretty much every error in reasoning that is possible to commit in his work on the subject of justice. His proposals to improve the lot of Earthlings all boil down to institutionalized theft and increasingly totalitarian government, which seems to be okay with his devotees because he says, mildly, that he means well. It is noteworthy that he has received a particularly enthusiastic reception in China. He calls this philosophy communitarianism. We are having trouble distinguishing Professor Sandel's vision of the ideal society from a life of slavery on a plantation, except that his plantation always has a good massa in the big house, of course. Among my friends and associates on planet Vulcan are some who point to the popularity of the work of Professor Sandel and his ilk as strong evidence that my mission on planet Earth is futile and doomed to failure. How is it that such a man can receive acclaim as someone of high intellect and superior morality and be showered with awards and honors. I can only reply to my Vulcan friends, and I admit my defense is rather fragile, that even though this man's easy answers and half-baked solutions have been met with approval by many millions of people, that this large number of people, in an absolute sense, actually consists of a narrow, self-selected group whose numbers represent a relatively small proportion of Earthlings. I still have hope for planet Earth, and I believe it will be worth it to keep trying. So since this man's arguments embody so much of what qualifies as echnorangi, we believe a review and critique of these arguments could be enormously helpful to Earthlings who are serious about promoting justice, as opposed to those who appear to be more urgently concerned with flattering themselves and each other for being nice people with good intentions. The underlying flaw in all of Sandel's arguments is that they constitute evolution denial and the failure to recognize the limits which nature places on human action. Indeed, his words provide little evidence that he has even a passing familiarity with evolutionary thinking. His ideas, diagnoses, and prescriptions are all based on intelligent design thinking. He exhibits no awareness at all of the nature of society as an evolving, complex, dynamical system with a life of its own, that is, a superorganism. And he is certainly unacquainted with the concept of emergent order. Freedom leads to chaos in his thinking. And he seems to believe that there exist special people, of whom he is one, who stand apart from the superorganism. Instead of seeing himself and his like as single cells within the superorganism, he presents himself and these other special people as intelligent designers, who in principle are capable of designing and constructing outcomes, and of replacing evolved outcomes with constructed outcomes. Like so many of today's intellectuals, he seems to believe in a phantom called capitalism, which he envisions as a system that has been intelligently designed and constructed by people who earn a profit by oppressing and exploiting the masses, and who work hard to maintain their supremacy by hook or by crook. He believes that his special people, the ones with morality and ethics on their side, ought to and can step in and create a new structure to replace something that he regards as just another structure. Let us remind ourselves what people of wisdom, such as Earthling civil rights leader Martin Luther King, Earthling martial artist and philosopher Bruce Lee, and many others have said about the prospects of constructing outcomes. Both of these widely admired people have been quoted as pointing out that in all the talk about means and ends, we must recognize that we cannot choose ends, we can only choose means. It is the choice of means, and not the intentions, that leads to the ends through evolutionary processes. Ironically, the means that these supremely ethical and moral people advocate as a solution to all problems is something that has traditionally and universally been regarded as immoral, which is theft. Please note as we go on how they rationalize their proposals. Let us review Professor Sandel's message in some detail. He states that people are assigned to jobs and social roles. There are countries on planet Earth where people are literally assigned to jobs, of course, China, for example. But he displays no awareness of the evolutionary and chaotic nature of the processes that result in jobs and social roles in a non-totalitarian society. Who does he think does this assigning? He states that life produces only winners and losers. He displays no awareness of the concept of a positive-sum game where there are not necessarily any losers. And if he is aware of the possibility, he evidently believes that it does not describe life as it actually is or can be on your planet. You might try to convince yourself that he is nevertheless making sense because he means winners and losers in a relative sense and by winners he means the top half of the distribution, and by losers he means the bottom half of the distribution. But I would say that this is a little too generous because the man reveals zero-sum thinking consistently. But in any case, to refer to the people on the lower half as losers is wrong on several levels, the most obvious being that in advanced societies, these losers are living a life that seemed an impossible dream to plain folk in earlier times. Most of these losers live in large, comfortable dwellings with wood floors, indoor plumbing, electric power, labor-saving devices, and entertainment systems, and they own one or more automobiles. And it is surely wrong and damaging to the social fabric as well as to the individuals to call them losers and fan the flames of envy by telling them that rich people are receiving more than their fair share. For a further discussion on this topic, I invite you to have a listen to the Season 2 podcast, Should We Resent Rich People? Sandel repeatedly hammers away on the point that nobody actually deserves their incomes or their social status, and it's ultimately mostly a game of luck. And this is the key to his case, that people like him ought to have all the authority and control all of the money. His definition of deserves is a little nebulous, but it seems to be based on the idea that a person only deserves rewards for something they themselves have done, which in his view is for anyone very little. Even such things as obtaining an education and living a productive life are not things that you deserve credit for. If you have achieved success, it's only because you were lucky to be born with the ability and opportunity to learn, and in a time and place where your efforts can be productively employed. In a recent interview on the Sam Harris podcast, Making Sense, where the subject under discussion was Sandel's latest book on the tyranny of merit, he gave the following examples. LeBron James's income, he says, is the result of the physical talents he was lucky to be born with and his luck living during a time when people are willing to pay to watch basketball games. What he receives by way of income has thus been bestowed on him by society, and he has done very little to deserve this income. J.K. Rowling likewise does not deserve her riches, although Professor Sandel generously proposes to let her hang on to the admiration and esteem she receives for telling good stories. I suspect that Ms. Rowling herself might have a suggestion for what Professor Sandel can do with his admiration and esteem. We need to step in, Sandel says, and demonstrate our superior morality by taxing away most of the wealth now controlled by these two individuals and others like them. Taking their wealth should not be seen as theft, he says. In fact, if we fail to levy the taxes and just let them keep it, we are in effect giving them rewards they do not deserve. He then addresses the argument that the amount of income people receive is generally commensurate with the value they have created. Does not income tend to flow to producers of value unless someone diverts it? To say that it does is certainly a valid generalization in a market economy, and it undermines Sandel's thesis, but he simply dismisses it, mostly on the basis of anecdotal evidence and other types of sloppy reasoning, and would rather talk about what he believes people deserve instead of about the value they have created. As an example which he apparently believes closes the door on the notion that income reflects social value, he brings up the example of Walter White on the television series Breaking Bad. He asks us to consider whether Walter, working as a modestly paid high school chemistry teacher, is actually contributing less to the common good of society, as measured by his income, than when he begins manufacturing methamphetamine and receives a much higher income. By asking this question, Professor Sandel reveals a failure to understand that value is ultimately subjective. There is no such thing as intrinsic value, as so many narrow and shallow thinkers like Professor Sandel seem to believe. Value is socially constructed by human interaction, and the price that something fetches in the market represents a consensus estimate of individual subjective values. There is no meaningful objective definition of intrinsic value, just as there is no meaningful objective definition of the common good. So even though you and I and many other people might agree with the opinion that a chemistry teacher is contributing more to the common good than is a manufacturer of recreational drugs, our opinions are not entirely relevant, and it is arrogant to think otherwise. If less income is flowing to the chemistry teacher, it means that he is not producing more value in that role in the eyes of those who are putting their money where their mouth is. If you understand value as subjective, and all that this subjectivity means, then you are hard put not to conclude that when force and fraud are minimized, value produced and income received track very closely. If consistency is a virtue, then Sandel is being virtuous when he consistently repeats his errors about intelligent design. For example, he claims that society has somehow positively chosen, among other possible choices, to make merit a governing philosophy. But in the absence of any chosen governing philosophy, would not merit, as measured by value created, spontaneously take one to the upper range of the income distribution? Governing could mean trying to stamp out the natural evolution of what he refers to as meritocracy, but in no way is it something arbitrarily chosen and created out of whole cloth. He also claims that society has chosen to make a college education the ticket to advancement. And he seems to believe that this is more than just a figure of speech, that something called society has a real existence and it has the capability of making choices. Society is somehow distributing economic rewards based on the arbitrary criterion of being college educated. And there's some truth to the notion that in the recent past, a college education has at least been a good ticket, if not the only ticket, to higher income. The reason ought to be obvious, but evidently it is not universally obvious, which is that a college education usually equipped its possessor with the ability to create more value, and not because the system sorted them into a higher caste because of their credentials. Society has, he goes on, made universities the arbiters of what counts as value, and of who receives the opportunities to progress. Society can fix higher education by intervening such that the elite universities are no longer the arbiters of who gets opportunities. The depths of this man's confusion is quite mind-boggling. But I guess that's to be expected when you don't perceive any problem with putting the cart ahead of the horse. And it's truly ironic that he would make such an argument in this time and place where more and more a college education does not become a ticket to a high-income job. Again, the reason ought to be obvious, which is that the value of a college education is being degraded by dumbing education down from bottom to top, promoting failing students, inflating their grades, and awarding college degrees to people whose ability to think and perform is inferior to the same abilities of people with a solid 8th grade education several generations ago. The value of a college education is being further undermined by the practice of creating areas of study that are no more than thinly veiled propaganda designed to enlist students in an ideological crusade, and which have little or no value, and even negative value, to the unfortunate and trusting adolescents who fall into these traps. More cart ahead of the horse thinking. The belief seems to be that the luster of scholarship can be transferred to ideas with little intellectual value if we all just agree to call the ideas scholarly and award degrees to the people who study them. What we are witnessing instead is that scholarly is merely losing its hard-won luster. Without any intervention by anyone with the intention of making it so, the value of a college degree is increasingly perceived as far less valuable than it once was, for the simple reason that in so many cases it is far less valuable. And just what is this society that he keeps referring to, as if it is a tangible thing and one that is capable of making decisions? Fascinating. And he goes on to additional reasons why certain people do not deserve their incomes, and that we are morally obligated to take it from them. He asserts that financial markets, in some sense, do not create value in the same way as does the real economy. And if we accept the truth of that assertion, then people who receive high incomes for working in finance cannot even claim that their incomes reflect the value they contribute, as could someone who works in the real economy. Although that too would be a mistake, because even in the real economy, outcomes are in fact all luck, he says. He makes a statement outright that ought to stand as a colossal embarrassment, but instead earns him applause, which is that only the primary activities in financial markets contribute to societal well-being. Primary meaning the initial channeling of investment funds towards companies. Blithely unaware that, without the existence of secondary markets, primary markets don't function very effectively. The reason is that without a secondary market, primary market investors are far more reluctant to invest, because without the secondary market, they would not have the option of converting their investments to cash by selling them to other investors. They would have to wait patiently for a return on their investment from the company they invested in. You might recognize this conceptual error as the theme of the unintentionally funny 1987 film Wall Street. The bad guy, Gordon Gekko, is portrayed as a corporate writer who takes over corporations only to shut them down, then plunders their assets and puts the employees out of work, out of greed. But why would anyone who is genuinely greedy shut down a company that is worth more alive than dead? Couldn't he satisfy more greed with something that is more valuable than with something that is less valuable? And if the company is in fact worth more dead than alive, shouldn't it be shut down so that its assets can be more efficiently deployed elsewhere? Professor Sandel's solution to the problem of people receiving high incomes in secondary financial markets is therefore to introduce a tax on financial transactions. And of course, this doesn't mean we shouldn't collectively take another bite with a wealth tax. What could go wrong? We expect mindless drivel from Hollywood, but it's a surprise when it is part and parcel of the work of someone who goes by the title of professor at a prestigious institution of learning. Professor Sandel goes on to inform us that speculation in financial markets also serves no useful purpose and subtracts from the common good by permitting speculators to earn, gasp, profits. He repeats the usual ignorangi that speculators are somehow able to stir up trouble out of thin air and then swoop in and take a profit, when in fact speculators are merely people who are willing and able to shoulder a risk that someone else, known as a hedger, wants to be free of, to the general benefit when these two types meet up and transact some business. There's more. People do not want the things they should want, Sandel says. Time to step in and correct people's mistakes. And this means for most of these people, we must restrict their freedom to choose for their own good, and if not for their own good, then for the common good. He notes that even if we were to succeed in providing equal opportunity for everyone, there would still be winners and losers, simply because of luck. And the winners would unrealistically believe that they have deserved what they won and that the losers deserved to lose, that they are at fault. Luck denial. And worst of all, the winners deny any sense of indebtedness, even though everybody knows they are obligated to give back. Thus, equal opportunity becomes the enemy, an unworthy goal that perpetuates unequal outcomes. He claims that the 2008 financial crisis can be attributed to a lack of regulation, and repeats the nostrum that bankers are to blame, as if finding someone to blame is tantamount to diagnosing the problem. And he says it was the best and brightest who thought deregulation was a good idea, just like it was the best and brightest who led America into the Vietnam War under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. The 2008 financial crisis was in fact a regulatory failure and not a market failure. Markets did indeed fail, but it was because the natural discipline of financial markets was short-circuited by regulatory action in the form of the too-big-to-fail policy. The problem of excessive risk-taking by management that regulation is supposed to fix is a problem that was created by regulation. So to summarize Professor Sandel's proposed path to a better world, start by telling lower-income people that their income level is just bad luck and that they should resent higher-income people because their income level is just good luck. Fan the flames of envy at every opportunity. Announce with surprise that there seems to be a spontaneous surge of concern about income inequality. And finally, solve the problem with confiscatory taxation. How perfect is all of this as an illustration of Friedrich Hayek's statement to the effect that our curious task as economists is to explain to people how little they understand about that which they propose to control. Looking at the silver lining on this toxic cloud, American Earthlings in particular should be cognizant and grateful that you live in a time and place where those who wish to enlist the institution of government to take your stuff are obliged to invent elaborate rationalizations for doing so. Throughout most of Earth's history and all over the planet, those who wanted to take just took, without apology. I invite you to watch the next essay on the Fascinating YouTube channel. Please recommend Fascinating to your friends if you find the lessons from nature in these essays personally valuable. Thanks to Track Tribe for allowing the use of their song, Helium. Live long and prosper. Savor your experiences. Treasure your memories. Anticipate a happy and rewarding future. And respect nature's wisdom.